Kip Eidenberg is the Senior Vice President of Government and Industry Relations at the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. And I thought having Kip come on and talk a little bit about what's going on in his industry, but also what's happening more broadly with the economy as we look at small businesses struggling to stay afloat. I thought having Kip come on just before Joe Biden heads out to Milwaukee would help bring really shed some light on some of the bigger issues that perhaps we haven't been able to focus on given the impeachment of President Donald Trump and, of course, all of that goes with it. Kip, thank you so much for joining us this week to discuss really the future of manufacturing and the economic recovery here on POTUS 120.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark.
So, Kip, let's just talk a little bit about your organization, the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. Now, this is a pretty broad coalition of companies that not only build agricultural equipment, but also like factory equipment and really big machinery. Talk to us a little bit about what your organization does, who it represents, and really how it's been impacted over the past year from the COVID.
Yeah, you bet, Mark. So very briefly, AEM, or the Association of Equipment Manufacturers, we represent the off-road equipment manufacturing industry. That's both the manufacturers and the suppliers. And, put differently, our member companies make the equipment that builds, powers, and feeds the world. And I think this is important, the 2.8 million men and women of our industry, and 187,000 of them, by the way, are in Wisconsin. They're not just welders and fabricators and machinists. They are also parents, they're coaches, they're mentors, they're farmers, and they're neighbors. And so when we talk about the policies that are important to those 2.8 million men and women, it's not just the policies that are important to the industry per se, whether that is a infrastructure investment, free and fair trade, or policies that strengthen rural communities, but I think it is about the policies that will help lift up all Americans. And let me tell you, you mentioned that the president is heading out to Milwaukee, which is great, by the way. That is where we're headquartered, and we're glad to have him in our hometown. Let me tell you what is on the mind of those 187,000 men and women in Wisconsin, and that is that President Biden's commitment to make bold investments in American manufacturing, industry, and innovation so that the future is made in America. And if that promise is kept, then we'll be interesting to hear what he has to say about it during his town hall, that equipment manufacturers can continue to create more family-sustaining jobs and better equip the U.S. economy to compete in the global economy. And to do that, President Biden will need to work with Democrats and Republicans in Congress to advance not only pro-manufacturing policies, but I think pro-American policies that are needed to strengthen and grow our manufacturing sector.
Kip, let's. I want to dive a little bit more deeply into some of those things, or at least some of the policy proposals that your industry would like to see put in place. But before we even get to that, I think you raise a very good point here, which is always discussed, but I think at no better time does it really need to be discussed is now, and that is the ability for bipartisanship to be extended, not only from the White House to Capitol Hill, but also from Capitol Hill back to the White House. Now, you've been around Washington for many years, as I have. I have seen things pretty bad over the years. I've never seen things this bad, though, and I just wonder if if this is a hurdle that you think that can be overcome. And speak, I guess, when I ask you this question, not with hope, but with reality. Like, what needs to help overcome this partisanship that is just really, really, really sharp on both sides of the aisle?
Well, it's a great question, Mark, and I think it's really basic in many ways. We need to get back to a common sense, solutions-oriented approach to governing. Our elected officials in Washington need to reach across the aisle and work in a bipartisan fashion to advance policies, whether pro-manufacturing or other policies, that will create more family-sustaining jobs for Americans and make sure that we grow the middle class. I mean, this should not be a radical idea, but sadly, these days, it is. And so I think, we all as Americans have an obligation and a responsibility. And again, I'd be interested to hear what some of the folks that participate in the town hall with the president have to say about this. We have to remind our elected officials that enough is enough. cheap campaign promises, slogans, and issues that are really more about messaging than making real progress cannot be acceptable anymore. We cannot tolerate that. We've got to get back to actually working for the American people. And I think that there are some opportunities, Mark, you talked about policy specifically. There are some opportunities here to advance some policy priorities that I think are truly bipartisan. Infrastructure, for example, it's one of those that is not just key to our industry, but I think it's key to the long-term success of our country as well. Infrastructure is pretty basic. We all need it. We all consume it. We all depend on it. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has made that more clear than ever. And so I think that is a great starting point for Republicans and Democrats and the president to sit down and say, okay, well, how can we make real progress for Americans? Well, let's start by investing in our infrastructure. That will create more good-paying jobs, and I think it will get the economy back up and running again.
Kip Eiterberg represents the Association of Equipment Manufacturers based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where President Biden will be there this coming Tuesday. He'll be doing a CNN town hall, taking questions from the audience, which will be interesting. Kip, I produced a Biden town hall back in September for CNN as well. We did it outside at a drive-in theater. It was quite a scene. This time we go inside as cases are starting to drop, and we'll have a socially distanced audience, but it's going to be very, very, very eerie, I think, getting back out there on the campaign trail as we have been pretty much, like everyone else, locked down at home. Kip, when we talk about specific policy, I'm glad you brought up infrastructure, because that's something I do want to do a deep dive on, because I do think that could be the uniting piece of policy that can actually get passed, in this very divided Washington right now. And before we even dive a little bit deeper into some of the other things that you guys are focused on, how has your members been hit by COVID? How bad has this been? Has there been some kind of inoculation for some reason? And when I say that, have they been able to dodge the economic bullet a little bit on this, or what is the state of your member companies right now in this economic times?
Well, that's a great question, Mark, and I think the verdict here is a bit mixed in terms of the impact on our industry. Obviously, about a year ago or so, when the pandemic really started to intensify, it hit our industry pretty hard initially. I think it hit a lot of industries hard, and obviously the safety and well-being of those 2.8 million men and women of our industry has always been the top priority, and so a lot of our member companies had to shut down and sort of readjust to operating in the COVID-19 pandemic environment. So that obviously had an impact. Then global supply chains, and domestic supply chains for that matter as well. They came under intense pressure early on in the pandemic, which obviously had a trickle-down effect on our member companies. The ability to get parts and components into manufacturing facilities, and then the ability to a certain degree to get finished products out. That hit us pretty hard, and I think it was more of an impact in some ways on the construction side of our industry than the agriculture side of our industry. Farmers still had to be out in the field, to plant and harvest, and grow the food that we all depend on. So we saw the impact a little bit more harder on the construction side. But overall, our industry, it took a hit, no doubt. But thanks to the essential nature of manufacturing and the steps that many governors took early on to make sure that our facilities and our member company facilities were able to stay open and on the job, the recovery was pretty quick as well. And I don't want to give you the impression that the industry has fully recovered. We have not. I think we've turned a corner since the height of the pandemic, with certainly the impact. But some of our smaller member companies, and particularly those who provide parts and components to the larger manufacturers, they're still struggling. And I think it's partly has to do with the fact that the economy is still not fully back to where it was before the pandemic. But also, we're still feeling a little bit of an impact from supply chains, and some of those smaller suppliers' ability to weather the economic downturn has had a trickle-down effect. So, I'd say that right now we're probably at least a year or two away from being back to where we were in late 2019, early 2019, early 2000.
Kip, what are some of the specific policies? I guess that's kind of an economic outlook that a lot of folks are looking at, saying like, in 2 years we'll be back. Although I got to tell you, these variants, these strains that kind of have been the offshoot of the original COVID virus, just certainly gives me pause that we're going to be living the rest of our lives in some kind of some kind of protective way, given the mutations that we've seen from COVID. So let's say it's about a year or two before we do see the economy come back. What are some specific policies right now? And let's hold off on talking about infrastructure, because I think that's just a fascinating conversation in and of itself, and we'll tackle that. But what are some of the specific things that you would like to see come out of the Biden administration and supported and championed by Congress? Are there tax things that you'd like to see? Are you concerned that Biden may perhaps roll back some tax cuts? What are some of the some of the things you're looking for, I guess, and some of the things that you're concerned may change?
Well, I think that's a great question, Mark. And it begins, as we've talked about, it begins with rebuilding and modernizing our nation's infrastructure. We've got to start there. An investment in our infrastructure, it's an investment in our country, and it is a jobs program. And I think the only way that we can stay competitive in the 21st century economy, both as an industry and as a country, is if we have a state-of-the-art infrastructure. And this includes, it has to be forward-looking, right? So this includes roads and bridges, but roads and bridges that anticipate the emergence of autonomous vehicles, water management systems that protect the watershed and also provide clean water for Americans, transportation systems that provide effective alternatives to the single passenger automobile. So, mass transit, a robust electrical grid that enables alternative energy sources to be fully integrated into our economy. We need safe, reliable, and affordable energy to be competitive. And then broadband access for every American. I cannot stress enough the importance of reliable, high-speed broadband.
Okay, I have to stop you there, because personally, I can tell you personally that I have encountered that myself, and I say this as somebody who comes from Washington, D.C., and who has everything at his fingertips. So, like, don't cry me a river, Mark, type of situation. But I have been at a place where there is no broadband, and it is very difficult to get a cell phone call out. It is very difficult to get any kind of strong internet, for that matter, other than having to use satellite television or something like that. So I do agree with you on the broadband. It's something that I think everyone has to experience a little bit now, especially those of us who have it, to understand what it means not to have it. I mean, it's almost like after those storms when you can't use your water for whatever reason, and then you realize how much you need water or how much you need electricity. Sorry, Kip, I interrupted you there.
No, but it's a great point, Mark. And let me share with you a brief anecdote here. And then, the times before the pandemic, I used to travel around the country, visiting with all of our member companies, and they, they're located, anywhere from Georgia to Washington State, Texas to Massachusetts. And we have a member company in Perry, Oklahoma. And one of the folks that worked there told me a story about how his wife, and they live about an hour and a half west of Perry, Oklahoma, she has to drive to the manufacturing facility, the plant, twice a week so that she can access reliable, high-speed internet so that they can pay their bills, they can do some shopping, they can download, educational resources for their children. And this is absolutely insane. There is no other way of putting that. The fact that we have Americans in our country who have to drive an hour and a half just so that they can connect to the internet, that is a big reason why we are not as competitive as we should be. I mean, the fact that millions of Americans do not have access to reliable high-speed broadband it means that we're leaving too many hardworking Americans at a disadvantage, given the modern importance of connectivity. You and I know it, right?
Well, I mean,
access to high-speed internet.
And we're seeing it with our kids now, right? With kids that are not able to have high-speed internet, let alone have computers. But I mean, assuming that they'd have that, but they can't get high-speed internet in order to continue learning at times when schools have to go virtual because of whatever spike in COVID cases. So, yeah, it really is something. I mean, I have to say, and I will say, as the arrogant East Coast person, I wouldn't say I'm elite, but person, that I am, is that I never really truly understood the broadband argument. I mean, I supported it, but it was nothing other than any other thing that people were advocating for here in Washington, D.C. But when you experience it, especially after how people right now have become so accustomed to everything being so immediate and at your fingertips, and when you realize that it's not there, it is really game changing. And to your point, I mean, how do you stay competitive if you're slow?
Right. No, you can't. And I think, if anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced the importance of investing in high-speed broadband. Whether it's the parents struggling to teach their children, or the veterans in rural areas that cannot access critical telehealth services, we absolutely have to make a long-term significant investment in our infrastructure, but in high-speed broadband in particular. But I think beyond, and you asked about what are those pro-manufacturing policies that are going to make a difference for our industry. Infrastructure obviously is one of them, and again, we think it really needs to start with infrastructure. We see it as a job still. We see it as a long-term investment in our country. But beyond that, Mark, the other thing that's really important to our industry, and again, many of those 187,000 men and women who build equipment in the state of Wisconsin, is trade. 30% of all equipment made in this country is destined for export. And the only way that we can sell more equipment is if we create more markets for it. And that means that we got to get back to trading with our friends and partners around the globe. And we've got to prioritize policies that make trade possible.
Kip, it would be interesting to see what happens on the trade argument, given the not only the struggles, I guess, between the two parties, but the internal struggles that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are dealing with right now. I think I was going to say let's jump right into infrastructure, but I think we've already jumped right into infrastructure. I think it is one of those policies, Kip, that I think we'll see potentially get done. I mean, I think there's going to be some kind of appetite for something to get done. And I think that very well may be it. I don't know. What are the odds right now? I know there are a lot of people. There's so much money at stake in a new infrastructure bill that would, for our listeners, as we're talking, which would basically pay for the whole electrical grid, and not the whole, but it would pay for upgrades to your water and your sewer lines and your bridges and your electrical grid. I mean, everything that we take for granted. And there's an incredible amount of money that's going to be attached to that. And Kip, what are the betting odds that this gets done this week when you're talking amongst other stakeholders about it?
Well, we are cautiously optimistic, maybe more so than we've ever been, right? And this is where the infrastructure week jokes come in, right? We've heard this over and over and over again. President Trump talked about it. He was going to make it a priority in his first 100 days or his first year in office. Before him, President Obama and President Bush talked a lot about it. They made some attempts at making a significant long-term investment in our infrastructure. It never really materialized. But more so now than ever, we are hearing from both Democrats and Republicans that they really do want to actually move forward with this. And I think, I don't want to oversimplify this, Mark, but we can no longer be focused on just how to pay for it. I mean, that is usually where it breaks down up on Capitol Hill. Democrats have one idea, Republicans have another, and the end result is that we end up doing nothing. But I think perhaps the pandemic, the realization that we need our infrastructure and we need it to work, and then the fact that we've got to do something about getting the economy back up and running again. We've got to put Americans back to work. I think maybe that has focused the minds a little bit more of lawmakers than it has in the past. And so we're seeing a real interest in moving forward. There's still going to be debate about how to pay for it. Some will say we should increase the gas tax. That hasn't been done since 1993. Some say it should be more private money than public money. Others are talking about a VMT, vehicle miles traveled type of user fee. Some are saying, hey, money is cheap right now. Let's just deficit fund it. But they are actually talking about how to pay for it rather than making up excuses for why they cannot pay for it. So I think we will see something happen, and whether it's part of the initial stimulus bill that they're still working on, the relief bill, whether it's also part of the recovery bill that we expect to follow in the next couple of months, and it will probably be a little bit in the first and a little bit more in the second. But I actually think it's going to happen this time around. And we've been making the case over and over again that, infrastructure is probably the most bipartisan issue there is, We joke about potholes not being Democratic potholes, Republican potholes. They're just potholes, and they're everywhere. And I think that that's finally maybe dawning on lawmakers that they have an opportunity here. And I think also, and we talked about this early on, I think there's more pressure right now on them all to get something done. I think Americans are just fed up with gridlock. They're fed up with gridlock on our roads. They're fed up with gridlock in Congress. So I think lawmakers are committed to making it happen, and we'll just have to see how big of an investment they make. I certainly hope that it's a significant one, but at this point, any investment is a good investment.
Kip, we'll have to leave it there. If you want to learn more about the Association of Equipment Manufacturers, you can go to their website, aem.org. And Kip, are you a social media type of fellow?
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow on Twitter at AEM Advisor. There's a lot of great news and updates about what's going on in the world of manufacturing.
Terrific. Well, hey, thanks so much for joining us, Kip, this week on Full Stop. It was an interesting conversation.